Hey guys, welcome to the real Mr. Beer, Mr. Beer's own channel. We're here to provide home brewing tips and equip you with all kinds of beer knowledge. My name's Josh Ratliff. I'm a BJCP certified beer judge. I'm the brewmaster here at Mr. Beer, and I'm also manager at Everything Homebrew, our little homebrew shop here in Tucson, Arizona. Today we're going to be brewing our Classic American Light. This is our #1 best-selling refill, and it is, I think it's a 4.2 rating on our reviews, and it's going to be about 5% ABV with the booster I'm going to be adding, and it's about 3.7 without the booster. It has an SRM of 2, making this our lightest colored beer. For those that don't know, SRM stands for Standard Reference Method, and it is the method brewers use to figure out the color of beer. It has 11 IBUs, making this one of the lowest IBUs, one of the lowest IBU beers that we have. IBUs are international bitterness units, and it's a system that tells how bitter a beer is. So this is going to be pretty low in bitterness, kind of similar to wheat beer too. And as far as commercial beers, this is going to be similar to your standard adjunct lagers, which would be like, Coors Light, Bud Light, Miller Lite, so on and so forth. And this refill includes 1 can of the extract, and it also includes 2 of the bags of booster and 1 no rinse cleanser. And of course the yeast is under the lid, which we're going to go ahead and open up right now. As I've said before, some people have had issues with these lids because they're on tight so that the yeast will stay in there and not fall out. So I just use a bottle opener, a can opener, and just kind of crack it a couple spots, and that loosens it up. Let's throw it off. Take that yeast out. Alright, first thing we're going to do with this is stick it in some hot water and let it soften up a bit. Alright, this is one of our standard refills, which is different than our deluxe refills. The deluxe refill, instead of the booster being included, it's the pale LME, which I don't have one out here. But if you're warming up the beer, your malt extract, and you're using the LME, you're going to want to have to you're going to want to put that LME in there too, because it'll also soften up and come out a lot easier. There we go. Thanks, Matt. And so this is the LME. This is what comes with the deluxe. The difference between this and the booster is that the booster is made from corn syrup solids, and so it's got maltose, maltotriose, and it will add ABV about 1.3% if you use both bags, without really changing the color at all, and it'll also add a little bit of body because of the dextrins. But this stuff, liquid malt extract, is made from barley. So it's for adding ABV, but you're also going to get some color, flavor, and some body. We do have different ones. We have the pale, which is our lightest one. We have smooth, which is kind of an amber one. It'll give some kind of toffee caramel flavors. And then we also have the robust, which is it has roasted malts. It's very, very dark, and it can be used in stouts and porters, but you can also use it in lighter beers to turn them into like red ales. So these are very versatile. In addition to the liquid malt extract, and we did go over extracts yesterday, so I'm not going to talk too much about them today, but we have the dry malt extract here, and this is a little bit more difficult to use for some people because it kind of clumps up. One trick for that is to use a whisk, and it'll dissolve pretty quickly if you do it that way. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and get some water going. So you're going to need 4 cups of water. And we do have filters on our taps here at Mr.Beer. It looks like we're offline. It says we're hosting Necro.
Yeah, they should be off though.
Starting to boil. And while that's doing that, I'm going to go ahead and sanitize all of my stuff. One thing that we didn't go over yesterday was how to install the spigot onto the fermenter, which has been a what's that?
Booster.
Oh right, booster. Let's do that first. Let's go ahead and get the booster in there before it gets too hot, otherwise it's going to be kind of difficult to dissolve. And it typically works best to do 1 bag at a time, till the first bag's at least a good way dissolved. And these whisks are really great for this. Okay, we can go ahead and add the second bag. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and start the heat while it's doing its thing. It will take a while to heat up, so this will be dissolved before it's at temperature. Oh, sorry guys. We got sound now. Okay, to recap, I used 4 cups of water in here and a couple of boosters. And we're going to go ahead and let those dissolve. I'm going to slow down a little bit, I'm splashing. Okay, that looks good enough for now. The rest of that should dissolve just fine. Alright, so moving on to the spigot. So we do have new spigots that are different from years past. These are more of a up and down spring rather than the old side-by-side ones. The thing I love about these spigots is that you can completely disassemble them and clean them from the inside out, so they don't get moldy on the inside or anything like that. Putting it on the keg you want to be sure the washer, the tapered end is facing in towards the keg, like this. And so you'll go ahead and put it in there. And you want to hand tighten these. You don't want to use any kind of tools because you can break the spigot. Okay, now once that's on there, you want to do a water test. We've had many customers call and say they lost their beer because their spigot was leaking, or because they didn't put it on tight enough, or they had the washer on incorrectly. So let's go ahead and do a little water test on this. Typically you'll want to do it for like 30 minutes or to an hour for a good water test, but we're just going to do, a couple minutes and check it. I'm going to go ahead and fill this up to line 1 because this water we're also going to use as our sanitizer. Alright, we got it up to line 1 on the back of the keg. If you do have our older kegs, it's going to be a 4.5 liter, and the number 2 is going to be the 8 liter. We updated the markings in the past couple of years. And it doesn't look like it's leaking. So we're going to go ahead and sanitize. So you want to pull out your no rinse cleanser, and you're going to use half of it. I'm just going to go ahead and eye what I think about half is. And that's good. And then we're going to go ahead and close it up and save the rest for bottling. Okay, now you're going to want to attach your lid. And because of the 2 notches underneath the lid, you're going to want to shake this over a sink because it will leak a little bit. Those notches are there to allow CO2 to escape during fermentation. If they weren't there, your keg would explode, and that would not be a good thing. So let's give it a shake for 10 seconds, 30 seconds. You really only need about 20-second contact time. Okay, that's good.
Can you show the notches one more time?
What's that?
Can you show the notches one more time?
Sure. Yeah, let's take a look at these notches here. Should be able to see them. There's one here and one up here. And so when the lid's on there, these are going to allow CO2 to escape through the threads. Get a little bit closer. So you don't want to block those notches. We've had people wanting to carbonate in their kegs and asking if they block those notches, if they can do that. No, you cannot. These kegs will explode. They're not intended for carbonation. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and run some of this through the spigot to allow the spigot to sanitize. And then we can go ahead and fill this up because this is where we're going to sanitize all of our other tools. So some of the other tools we're going to be using today will be our spoon and our can opener. And then we can go ahead and dump the rest of this out. And as the package says, this is a no rinse cleanser, so you do not rinse this out. It is food grade. If you rinse it out, it defeats the purpose of using it for sanitizing. Okay, and good timing. We have a boil. Okay, we'll go ahead and remove that from the heat. And we're going to go ahead and open this can. And again, you're going to open these cans from the bottom. Because of the lip on the top, you can't open them from there because that's where the yeast is stored. And I definitely need a better can opener in here. Wow. Okay. Okay, again, if you're using like a range top stove, electric stove, you want to take it off of the heat. With these induction burners, it's not really necessary because the heat turns off right away. Go ahead and grab our sanitized spoon and get to pouring. It may help for some of you, depending on your can opener, to remove these labels because they will leave paper bits of paper in your wort. Okay. You want to get this dissolved until there's really nothing else coming off the spoon. And don't be afraid to scrape the bottom and get all that stuff off the bottom. One of the reasons you want to take it off the heat and not boil your HME is because it can caramelize some of the sugars, rendering them unfermentable. It'll darken your malt extract too much, and it could ruin some of the hop flavors in there. So you always want to remove it from the heat. Okay, that looks good. And we have a pre-sanitized funnel. We're going to go ahead and pour the wort into the beer with, or into the fermenter. And I have cold refrigerated water set aside. You want to use cold refrigerated water so that when you pour that hot wort in there, it's going to come to the correct temperature for yeast pitching. You want to be about 65, 70 degrees. So go ahead and fill this up to line 1, which is a gallon of water. Okay. Put that in there. And carefully pour your wort in. It is hot, so be very careful. Okay.
So why do you use a funnel?
I'm using a funnel because it's just a little bit easier. I can actually pour it in there. I've made enough of these batches that I can pour it in there without using the funnel. But you know, if you're comfortable enough, you don't have to. But it is a lot easier to use the funnel for sure. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and top off the rest with more cold refrigerated water. Again, you want to use filtered or spring water. Purified water, reverse osmosis water is fine. Just try not to use distilled water as it lacks minerals necessary for proper yeast health. All right. So we're at line 2. You want to give this a nice vigorous stir, trying not to scratch up your keg too much. Don't even really hit the sides if you can help it, because scratch is going to harbor bacteria. which can infect your beer. But you do want to stir it up to oxygenate the wort, so the yeast can have steady oxygen to begin their fermentation. And we've got our brewer's yeast. We're ready to pitch. Sanitized with a sanitized scissors. Go ahead and open it up and add your yeast. And there is no need to stir because the yeast are like goldfish. They will find their food. And that is how to brew the Classic American Light. And it's probably also, in addition to being our most popular refill, it's probably one of our most versatile refills because of how light it is. You can add a whole bunch of different kinds of grains, fruits, all kinds of different things. It's a very, very versatile refill for any kind of beer, really. Okay, so now that that's done, I wanted to go over yeast with you guys today. Talk a little bit about different types of yeast, how to choose proper yeast for your beer, the differences between dry and liquid, and that's where we'll start. So dry yeast, which as you've seen comes in these little packages, it's very, very versatile. It lasts much longer than liquid yeast, but the problem with dry yeast is that it's very limited in variety, due to the fact that only certain yeast strains can handle the freeze-drying process. So not every yeast can be freeze-dried. So with liquid yeast, you will have a lot more variety in yeast, but you won't have the shelf life that these have. Another thing is that dry yeast typically have about 200 to 250 billion cells, so you don't require any kind of yeast starter. Typical liquid yeast like White Labs and Y yeast are about 100 billion yeast cell count, so you might want to do a starter if you're doing any beer above 1.065 in gravity. And I'm going to go over how to do a starter, and I'm also going to go over how to reuse your yeast that you used in a previous batch. It's known as harvesting or yeast cropping. So for the different kinds of yeast, there are German yeast, Belgian yeast, there's different types of lager yeast. The most common yeast strain used in brewing is called the Chico strain. You may know it as Safale US05. It's also known as Y Yeast 1056 or White Labs WLP001. They're all basically the same strain. This strain was isolated by Sierra Nevada Brewing Company back in the 80s. And it has become the most popular yeast for homebrewers worldwide because of how versatile it is. It's a very neutral yeast. It doesn't put off any kind of esters or phenols or flavors. So it's pretty flavorless and it flocculates out pretty well. And that's a term I want you guys to learn as well, flocculation. Flocculation is how well a yeast kind of settles. So a low flocculating yeast, let's take a Hefeweizen for example, or those hazy IPAs that are becoming so popular now. They use yeast that have low flocculation, so they're going to be more suspended, and it's going to cause the beer to be very hazy, and the sediment is going to be kind of loose and fluffy. Whereas a high attenuating yeast such as Safale US05 or many lager yeasts, they're high flocculating yeast in that they settle out really clear and make a very compact and tight sediment at the bottom of your fermenter. Attenuation is another word in brewing that has to do with the percentage of sugars that the yeast has consumed. So say a low attenuating yeast that attenuates about 70% is going to leave your beer sweeter than 90% attenuating yeast, which will leave your beer much drier. Belgian Saison yeast, for example, have anywhere between 90-95%, leaving the beers extremely dry. Some Hefeweizen yeast and some English yeasts don't attenuate as well, so they'll leave the beer a little more malty sweet. And then yeast flavor. So as I was saying, the US-05, the Chico strain, is pretty flavorless. It's a very neutral yeast. But there are many yeasts that create all kinds of different flavors. A lot of these flavors are called esters, such as Hefeweizen, again, is a great example. That yeast that stays in suspension also provides some of the flavor. It's a yeast-forward beer. In fact, Hefe means yeast and Weizen means wheat. So it'll create kind of banana flavors. The banana is from isoamyl acetate, and there are all kinds of other different chemicals and esters. And it not only can create the flavor, but it can also help with the mouthfeel. It'll give kind of a pillowy, soft kind of mouthfeel. Instead of being like with the US-05 or lager yeast, it'll be more crisp and clean. Then there's Saison yeasts. Again, I want to bring into the subject because they're pretty unique in that they're extremely attenuative, and they not only will consume sugars, they'll consume starches, they'll chew through any beer. And they can create kind of farmhouse esters, or they can be a little more neutral. So that would be the difference between, say, a Belgian Saison yeast and a French Saison yeast. French Saison yeasts are drier, cleaner, and Belgian Saison yeast will be more estery. So the different types of strains for so for German ales, there are a lot of different brands and strains. Some of my favorites, one of them is from Imperial Yeast. It's called what is that one called? Kaiser. Yes, Kaiser. It's a great yeast. I use that for Berliner Weisses, any kind of German ale where I kind of want a nice clean character to it. Otherwise, some of the German lager yeasts and German wheat yeasts are some of the best in the world. The two most popular would be like our SAF brew WB40 is a great wheat yeast. It's actually isolated from the Weihenstephan brewery in Belgium, which is the world's oldest brewery, though that is disputed. As is the German W40 that I wish I had it on me right now. You think you can grab one for me, Matt, from the fridge? Just grab me a variety of the dry yeasts. And then there's your American lager yeast. Here we go. So this is the Safale US-05 right here, which is the Chico strain. And this is the most common strain to use in the world. And this is its British cousin, the S04. This is an English yeast. Alright, thanks guys. Nice, they're gonna hand me all kinds of yeast here. Okay. So we'll get a picture on that S05. There we go, a little bit closer here. So that's your S05. This one's the S04, a British ale yeast. I think the S04 was isolated from like Bass, possibly. Don't quote me on that. This is the wheat beer, the Weihenstephan strain. That is a hard word to say. And this is really great for wheat beers. This is one of the estery ones that creates those banana clove esters. And if you want to kind of see what wheat yeast looks like, or what dry yeast looks like, it's these little tiny pellets. Okay, and then next up we've got T58. This is a a Belgian yeast. It's really estery, but instead of like banana clove, it's going to have more sweeter, kind of like bubblegum notes, kind of fruit notes to it. It's really great for any kind of Belgian ale. It'll work for certain types of saisons or wits as well. Speaking of saison, this is the Lallemand Danstar Bell Saison. And this is a great yeast for any kind of saison or any high gravity Belgian ale. These saison yeasts are really great because they can be fermented up to 90 degrees. The higher the temperature, the more esters you're going to get out of them. And the same thing is true with wheat yeast. They can be brewed very high temperatures. You get more banana notes the higher temperature you ferment. And these are the older White Labs vials. This was a cream ale yeast, and then these are the newer ones, which I kind of like these a little better. Okay, so, and then so there's American, English, Irish yeast. So if you're doing Scottish ales, this SO4 is going to be great for that. For any Scottish ale, Irish ale, anything kind of UK or European. Then we've got the different lager yeasts. We won't go into that too much. We'll go into later program when we do just lagers, and we'll talk about lagers. Lager yeasts are a different strain of yeast, whereas most ale yeasts are Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Lager yeasts are, I believe, Saccharomyces uvarium or something similar to that. And then there's your ciders, and people have asked what yeast do I use for like hard apple ciders, things like that. It's really up to you. It depends on the type of flavor you're trying to create. For example, I did a Belgian style cider a while back where I used a Belgian yeast in there, and those esters with the apple was amazing. It was tremendous. This is one of the popular ones that is good for. So if you can also use wine yeast for your ciders, and especially if you're going to be doing like something 10% or higher. The Premier Cuvée, and I think Lewis asked what yeast does Mr. Bell sell with their cider. Typically it's the Cefale SO4 that comes with it, because it's an English yeast and it attenuates a little bit less than the 05, so it'll give you a little more sweetness. Although keep in mind, our cider kit is more like a dry English cider, so it's not going to be nearly as sweet as your typical American ciders. But this is a great yeast. It'll give kind of some bready notes. But if you do want a more bright appley cider, you can use a US-05 instead. Or again, you can just use a wine yeast as well. And I try to tell people, and I know that websites and all kinds of books will say, use champagne yeast for your ciders, but unless you're fermenting at a very low temperature, like 65 or so, I recommend steering clear of champagne ciders or champagne yeast or any yeast that has like 20% alcohol tolerance. The reason for that is because if you ferment at your standard room temperatures, it's going to strip flavors away, especially if you're making something like a mead where the honey flavors are very delicate. So you want to try to use a less vigorous yeast. That Premier that I showed is a great yeast for meads or any kind of wine. Okay, so let's move on to a little bit of some demos here. I want to kind of demonstrate how to harvest yeast from batches that you've already done. So, go ahead and set this aside. So I'm not sure if you can see this. Yeah, you can see this from back there. This big guy right here is an ESB I brewed for the National Homebrew Competition and also for the Arizona Spring Classic Competition. And I went in and racked it today into secondary. And what I did with the yeast in the bottom, I took 1 gallon of water and I boiled it. And then I let it cool and I added it to the tube on the bottom. And as you can see here, if I didn't disturb it too much, looks okay. So this bottom part right here, that sediment there is trube. That's not really any good to use. You want to leave that behind when washing your yeast or cropping your yeast. All of this cloudy, milky area, that's the yeast. That's what you want. So one thing to do when you're trying to separate it from the tube is to put the whole thing on the side and let it settle that way. Be sure you didn't put, you have a big enough container so it's not coming out of the top. But put it on its side and let it kind of settle here, and it's a lot easier to pour it off. And so what you're going to do, you can use, a lot of people use mason jars. I don't have any mason jars on hand right now, so I'm using my Erlenmeyer flasks. Normally, if after this sits for a while, I just did this today, but it'll leave a white film on the bottom, and that's your yeast, because this has been separated from the tube using the method that I showed you. So So how do you use this? Well, what you're going to want to do, especially with yeast that you've harvested, or yeast that are, again, if you have a gravity that's kind of high, it's going to be a high alcohol beer. It's recommended that you do a starter if you're, just using any kind of yeast. So I'm going to set that aside and have Rick hand me another one of those liquid yeasts, and I'm going to show you guys how to do a starter. Yes, perfect. Thank you. All right, you want to open these guys slowly because they can be under pressure. Okay, so this little guy here is called a stir plate. You don't need to use one, you can just shake it up every so often. So what I'm going to do, this is some wort I have. This was, you want your wort for this to be about 1.040 gravity. So what I do, it's this amount, which is a little under 800 milliliters. I did, I think it was a half a cup of DME, and that'll get you about 1040. In fact, let's see if we're there, because I didn't even test it today. I'll go ahead and use my refractometer and take a look. And as you guys can see, I should be able to see. Do the top one here. Okay, we'll try this top one. It works a little better. And you'll see that it's right at 1040. All right. So what we're going to do with this is we're going to go ahead and pour our liquid yeast in there. And then you're going to have this little guy. This is a little magnet. It's called a stir bar. And this goes inside, as so. And you go ahead and you have a foam stopper for this. You can also use aluminum foil. Make sure your foil or anything you're using is sanitized, and especially make sure this is sanitized before you use it. You go ahead and put it on there. So this has a magnet in it that on a wheel that spins, and it stirs it up. And that keeps the yeast in suspension so that it can reproduce and grow. And you want to keep doing that anywhere from 8 to 24 hours, depending on the size of the yeast pitch you're going to need. If you're making beers above 1065, or if it's a lager, or if your yeast is old, you may really want to consider doing a yeast starter. Again, if you don't have a stir plate, you can always just shake it up, every couple hours or every time you walk by it, and it'll work just fine. Or you can get a stir plate. They can be kind of expensive. 60 bucks is the cheapest ones I've seen. But there are DIY plans online. Brew magazine and BYO online magazines both have plans for making these from scratch. They use I think they use rare earth magnets from a computer and also a computer fan, and you kind of glue the magnet onto it, and it's really cool. I've seen some really clever ones. And it's variable speed, so you can turn it up or down. But yeah, that's basically a yeast starter. Once it's done, you'll want to refrigerate it. And then you can kind of, if there's a lot of liquid on top, you can go ahead and pour that off and just shake it up so it's a slurry, and then add it directly into your beer. And now, so that's that, and we'll go ahead and start taking some questions. Let me go ahead and scroll up here and see if I've missed anything while I was talking. Okay. What is attenuating? And we did go over that. Yes, we do sell all those items. We don't sell liquid yeast, unfortunately, at this time, although we did just release the American Resolution Hazy IPA with the Barbarian yeast. It's very limited, and we do have a few left, so I recommend picking one up if you have the money, because it's an amazing beer. and that's an amazing yeast. And in fact, I kind of want to touch on that too. So if you noticed in that recipe, you're actually going to be dry hopping during active fermentation. It's kind of unheard of in brewing, and it's a brand new technique just in the past few years that breweries like Hetty Topper and Trillium back in the East Coast started in New England. That's why they're known as New England IPAs. There's a technique in there. It's called biotransformation of hop oils. So somehow, and again, this isn't fully understood by science yet, but somehow the yeast can transform some of the hop oils into other types of oils. So from myrcene to lysine or something like that. For example, Simcoe, which is typically kind of a piney hop but can have some citrus notes, when you put it through BT, biotransformation, by adding it during active fermentation, like the third day of fermentation, it turns those oils into more tropical flavors. So it goes from a piney hop to kind of a tropical hop. That's why a lot of those hazy IPAs are so fruity, because of that biotransformation of hop oils. Okay. And yeah, New England IPAs are great. I'm actually going to an event tomorrow, Juicy Brews, and it's all New England IPAs. It's a craft beer fest. It's going to be great. You don't need to do this for Mr.Beer refills, the whole yeast thing, unless, like I said, your yeast is old or you're doing like a really big beer. Like if you're doing a lock, stock, and barrel aged stout, which is one of our highest alcohol beers, or Novocaine, which is one of our big barley wines. They use 3 cans of malt extract in those, so they're going to be very high alcohol, and you're going to need a nice, healthy yeast pitch. So it could help to do a starter. If the yeast is fresh and it's dry yeast, you don't need to do a starter, because again, they have 250 billion cells. But if it is past the date by like 4 or 5 months, you may want to consider doing a starter. And again, it never hurts to do one. There are a couple of exceptions, such as wheat beers, saisons. Sometimes you want to underpitch because of the esters they create. Underpitching will force the yeast to have to procreate and reproduce to fit the size, the volume of the container. That reproduction period, which is called lag time, can create some of those esters, make them even much more forward, like wheat yeasts. So underpitching your wheat yeast a little bit by using a little bit less than normal, and fermenting at warm temperatures will give you like a banana bomb beer. Amazing. If you do, and it's really crazy too, because wheat yeast, if you ferment at cool temperatures, it's going to be more spicy, like cloves, and less fruity. So you can have a completely different beer using that yeast depending on the temperature that you're fermenting at. Where can I buy hazy IPAs? About brewery suggestions. Beerniak, you can find them pretty much any local brewery. Almost every local brewery is jumping on the bandwagon because it's a really big trend right now. So I'm pretty sure at least one of your local breweries will have some hazy IPAs available. We have one brewery here called Pueblo Vita. That's pretty much exclusively all they do, and they are really great about it. All right, does anyone else have any more yeast questions? Let me see if I've missed any questions here. What is trube? Okay, that's a good question. So the trube is going to be, it's basically going to be proteins. If you're doing all grain batches, it's going to be grain particles. So if you're doing all grain, you're typically going to have a little bit bigger trube than when you're doing extract. But it's proteins, fatty oils from the hops, vegetable matter, basically just all the scrap from the beer. And because it's heavier and it kind of coagulates together and falls to the bottom, and Irish moss will help with this. It's actually a seaweed that you can add to your beer in the last 10 minutes of boil or whatever, and it'll help clarify. It's not necessary with Mr. Beer kits, but when you're using a lot of grains or all grain batches, it's definitely helpful to have. Can you pitch too much yeast? Lewis, well, I mean, you can't really. I mean, you can. It can be too yeasty, but there are calculators. our friends over at Mr. Malty. It's a online website with all these brew tools and calculators you can use. They have a yeast pitch calculator. So you basically put your gravity, and then you put your your batch size. You put the date of your yeast because it'll tell you how viable it is. Because the longer the older the yeast gets, the less viable it becomes. And that's a great site for doing figuring out how big your yeast pitch should be. It doesn't hurt to have more yeast in there than normal, because that'll give you a nice healthy pitch, which will give you less lag time if you want a nice cleaner beer, and it'll give you a really nice healthy starting fermentation. So that means less byproducts like acetaldehyde, diacetyl, and things like that. What's the difference between beer yeast and dough yeast? Not a lot. They're both Saccharomyces strains. The thing is when you try to brew with, so dough yeast is formulated to create more CO2 and hardly any alcohol. So when you try to brew with a bread yeast, it's got a lot of esters too, really bready. So your beer is going to taste very yeasty. It's going to be very low alcohol and very carbonated. So it's not recommended to use beer yeast, though there are some historical style beers that have historically used beer yeast in them, and they are usually about 2 or 3% alcohol at most. Yeah, and another problem with liquid yeast, holding it here and selling it, is that it's got such a short shelf life, usually 4 to 6 months tops, if 6 months. But whereas dry yeast can last for a couple of years. But hopefully in the future we'll be able to bring that for you. We don't really have a big walk-in fridge or anything like that to be able to stock it at this time, but it's something we're looking into for the future. Saccharomyces, Lewis, that is the name that's what yeast is called. So sacca is sugar, and myces is fungus. So it's basically a sugar fungus. And I wish I had a picture of the cells I could show for you. Maybe next time. And another thing about yeast is that I'm just going to touch on a little bit, because this is way more advanced, is actual yeast harvesting from the wild, where you're going out and actually getting yeast from the air and harvesting it. This takes a lot of equipment. It takes a really nice microscope. If you're trying to do bacteria as well, harvesting things like lactobacillus or wild Brettanomyces, then you're going to have even more powerful telescope, because what you're looking for is called the morphology, and that's the shape of the yeast or the bacteria, and that can tell you what kind it is. And so the way that they do this is they have agar plates with agar, which is kind of a solution. It's kind of a gel solution, and then you'll get grab some leaves from a tree, put them in a little solution. You'll run a swab from there, or it's a loop. It's like a little. It's like a long thing with a tiny little circle on it, and then you'll scrape on these agar plates, and you'll kind of grow cultures, and then you can actually isolate the yeast from the bacterias, and choose which ones you want to do, and then grow them up. It's a really great thing. Arizona Wilderness is a brewery up in Gilbert, Arizona, and they actually have a cool ship attached to a truck. A cool ship is a big giant square vat full of beer. It's very shallow, so that there's a lot of surface area on the beer. And these are used in Belgium for like lambics, because they're spontaneously fermented, meaning they just take anything from the air. So these guys aren't even like isolating the yeast. They're just exposing their beer to the night air. And these guys at Arizona Wilderness, they built a cool ship on the back of a pickup truck, and they drive it up into the mountains and camp up there for the weekend and inoculate their beer with the wild yeasts and bacterias, and they make all these amazing sour ales and Flanders style ales, and it's really great. And yes, Bierniak, spontaneous fermentation is magic come to life. It is amazing. I want to get into that more. I want to study it more. I'm looking to get my own microscope and harvesting my own house strains and mixed cultures, and I'm really into that. And by the way, if you guys are into sours or Brettanomyces or wild yeast or anything like that, or learning more about that, I recommend a website called Milk the Funk, and it is incredible. Those guys are brewers from around the world who go on there with tips, and they talk about new strains and all these different things. It's amazing. Milk the Funk, they're awesome. Who provides Mr. Beer with yeast? Well, the yeast that comes from that's under our lids is the Cooper's strain. So it's the same yeast that's used in Cooper's beer. It's been used for over 100 years. Cooper's Brewery in Australia. You may be familiar with their sparkling ale, which is actually its own BJCP style, which is pretty cool. And I really do like their beers. They are a little fruitier than American beers. They have a little bit more kind of fruity esters to them. But I love that they're bottle conditioned, and there's, the yeast is still in the bottle, and they're good stuff. So it's a pretty good all-purpose yeast for pretty much any kind of strain. The rest of our SAF ale products we typically get from different manufacturers. We also, here at my homebrew store, I sell Giga Yeast, which is out of San Francisco, and I also sell Imperial Yeast, which I believe is out of Oregon, I think. Both really amazing companies, really amazing yeast varieties. Yeah. Let's see. Sugar Fungus, new band name. Excellent. All right, looks like we got about 8 minutes left. And I think I've pretty much covered anything. Anybody else got any more questions? All right, well, while we're killing the time, Rick, you want to actually... I'll grab it. Nice. I know where it's at here. I'll grab me a couple glasses.
3.
So this is, 3 glasses. So this is a beer a customer brought in. It's an all-grain batch. I thought I'd try it in front of you guys. It's an oatmeal stout. I helped him make it, or I helped him with the recipe a little bit, gave him some pointers, and it's being entered in the National Homebrew Competition. And Matt's going to grab us some glasses, and we're going to see how it tastes. The temp of the wort that I just brewed. Once you put they want to see Matt. Once you put the cold water in there, it should be at about 65-70 degrees. All right, let's see how this looks. Nice color. It's got some nice head on there. Ooh. And I'll pour this one for these guys to pass around. Yeah, glass is a little dirty.
Yeah. Oops.
All right. Oh yeah, Matt gets some beer for the effort for sure. Yes, he is real. What type of beer is it? This is an oatmeal stout. Nice aroma. Rich, a little bit chocolate.
Carbonation.
Yeah, carbonation's on point. Really smooth. It's not too stringent or bitter. It's not too sweet. You can taste a little bit of that oatiness. Yeah, he did a great job on this. I'm actually kind of worried because I also entered a stout into the competition.
So now the competition.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, beer judge in action, absolutely. Oh, that's good. So yeah, and if you guys have any questions about yeast, or you want to experiment, I always encourage people to experiment with yeast. Like, I know that, a Saison strain is typically for Saisons, but I've seen crazy things like, god damn, they finished that fast. But I've seen crazy things like milk stouts brewed with Saison yeast, which is crazy because Saison yeast makes it very dry, but then the lactose sugar adds some sweetness back to it. And I had one I can't remember what brewery it was from. It was definitely from outside of Arizona, but it was pretty amazing. So experiment as much as you can if you want to. What's that beer behind you in the carboy? That is my ESB, English Special Bitter. It's in BJCP would be considered a strong bitter. That's for the National Homebrew Competition, and I also have some entries in the Arizona Spring Classic. What is my favorite beer? Well, my favorite beer style is saisons, which probably explains why I talk about them so much. But I love saisons a lot. I also love, anything with Brettanomyces. I love that funky flavors that it creates. It can be kind of smoky. It can be fruity. It can have some kind of farmhouse notes to it. I also love anything with quike yeast, which is something I didn't really touch on today, but I still have about 5 minutes, so I can go into that really quick. Quike yeast, it's spelled Kviek, and it's a Norwegian type of yeast that's becoming very popular. There are several different strains of it: the Voss strain, Wolfstadter strain, a lot of different ones. And these yeasts are incredible because they can be dried very easily. They can last much longer. I just got this Wolfstadter strain the other day. Apparently there were only 50 vials available, and it was isolated from a yeast ring. In Norway they would traditionally have these wooden rings where the yeast is on it, and they would put that into the beer. And this yeast was found in this guy's father's basement. It had been there for over 25 years, and they were able to turn it back on and grow it up. So it's crazy how strong and hardy that yeast is, and I would not be surprised if at some point the Voss strain, which is a very clean yeast, even at high temperatures, I wouldn't be surprised if that one day replaces the Safale USO5, the Chico strain, just because of how versatile it is, the shelf life of it, how well it ferments. I mean, you can ferment, down to your final gravity in 4 days with that stuff. It's insane. So that's something we'll get into later. I might do a whole show just on those yeasts, or we might even do a more advanced yeast kind of show. Whatever you guys want. We'll get your input on our community forums and on our website and everything too. And as far as my favorite beer goes, I don't really have a favorite single beer. I have favorite styles, but there's just so many breweries and so many amazing beers out there. I mean, it's really difficult for me to pick one. I would have to say that one of my very favorite local beers is called German Chocolate Cake from Borderlands Brewing Company, and it's I believe it's a porter that's it's very chocolatey. It's brewed with coconut and like praline almonds, and it's incredible. It tastes exactly like German chocolate cake. And yeah, we're going to be doing another stream on Tuesday. We're going to be doing another standard Mr.Beer refill. We will be doing more different beers. We'll be getting into some of the recipes. We're just kind of trying to dial in the show and everything. And we'll have more, I'm going to have a lot more engaged kind of shows. We're going to have special guests. We're going to be doing giveaways, contests. So keep tuning in. Be sure you follow the page so that you can, qualify for the contests we're going to have. IPA, what about it, Lewis? And can you get a calendar of topics? Yeah, we'll probably put something up like that. And we'll know exactly what the next show is going to be at the end of every show. We'll let you know. IPA, make it. Oh, I'm going to make my hazy IPA, which I call cryonic suspension. And it uses the barbarian yeast, and it also uses cryo hops, which I'll talk about in a future show when we do the topic on hops. I want to thank everybody for joining us again. Join us again on Tuesday. We're going to be doing the Aztec Mexican Cerveza. Might do a little twist on there, throw a little lime or some lemon peel in the batch. We'll see. And again, I want to thank you guys for joining us. Be sure to go on our community forums, give us some feedback. Go to our Facebook page, give us some feedback. And yes, it's going to be a Mr. Beer recipe. Tasman, it'll be a Mr. Beer recipe. we're gonna be doing a bunch of Mr. Beer recipes to start, and then we'll start moving into doing more advanced recipes on hop malt extracts, partial mashes, and also our all grain as well. But that'll be a little bit further down the road. So thanks a lot, guys, and I will see you Tuesday.